Next Gen Group presents Our Story of Transition with your hosts, Becky and Christine Hopko.
Hi, welcome to our story of transition. I'm Becky,
I'm Christine.
and this is episode 3, and we are going to talk about the cross-dressing. Some transgender go through this, some don't, some in between.
Well, I don't know whether I agree with that, but I
Okay.
think probably all transgender people, for the most part, probably have some kind of phase where they feel out of place with themselves. So that tends to lead towards cross dressing. But then
Well,
again, I can't be sure. So all I know is what I have experienced myself. So
I've seen some, and again, I think this probably goes to the age when you decide, or not decide is the wrong word, realize
mm,
that you're in the wrong body, whatever that is. Um,
right,
I mean, for our story, Christine cross-dressed young, but continued on as a male, and it became part of our relationship later on. So I'm going to let her speak to that.
yeah. I mean, I was an early bloomer, so to say. I started really, in all reality, I started cross dressing when I was about 5 years old. So my earliest recollection of my childhood is probably about age 4, age 5, somewhere in there. And I know that even at that age, I was borrowing my mother's things. So started out with just jewelry, and then of course it graduated, so to say, up from there. But there's many, many years of that, and um, a lot of subtle hinting, I guess. But hindsight is 2020. So it was, at least at the time, and because of the lack of the internet, because we're talking 1974 here and up. I didn't have any resources to understand what a transgender person even was.
Nor did
All
society in general. I
right at
mean,
that time, nobody knew what a transgender person was. Unless you were involved in the medical community, maybe as a specialist or maybe a psychologist, you
or
would have.
in New York City.
Well, yeah, probably, or LA, right,
Right,
or
the
some
coast.
some big urban center. You would never have heard of such a term. So all I knew is what my family unit knew. So, and that was boys and girls, right?
Right. And again, that black and white, male, female type of thing. So, he, because at the time
Right.
was a he, and sometimes I'll reference that into the time of contact or context, excuse me. So at that time, he grew up and also started cross dressing again a little bit around 16.
No, I was cross dressing a lot.
Oh, see, you didn't even share
So
that with me. The story that I had heard was it
no,
was early and then it
yeah.
really.
No, I started early off, with borrowing jewelry from my mother, and it just kind of progressed from there. By the time I was 7, I was pretty heavily into cross dressing on my own in my bedroom, where I would get dressed under my pajamas. So, and hide it underneath my pajamas and then go to bed that way. And that was pretty much standard for many, many of my childhood years. So, and I had an older sister who was 1 year older than me, and she knows it now, so I can actually say this out in public. But yes, I was borrowing her items as well. So, but all of that, because of the lack of exposure to an understanding of what being transgender was. I mean, it all just seemed very innocent to me at the time. But it also was this big taboo thing,
Mhm.
because I never had a talk with my parents, especially not my mother, about the whether this was right or wrong. I just knew, of course, that you're not supposed to take things without people's
Well, I
permission.
mean, at that time in life
So,
too, I mean, boys played with trucks,
right,
girls played with dolls, and there was no in between. There was no buddy doll. That wasn't until the 80s,
right,
where they started trying to
make things
create
more
some
gender neutral,
general
right?
things.
But even so, I mean, I liked to play. My parents bought me all the boy toys. I had my bicycle, I had my big wheels, I had my toy soldiers, I had my sand pit and my
And you
construction
enjoyed that.
toys. Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed playing with that stuff. Of course, I was a little destructive, but however, it's not like I didn't mind playing with those things. It's just I had this tendency at times to want or to a desire to feel comfort in wearing these clothes that were different, and as I developed through the years, that I understood that were not, so to say, normal for me.
But at this time,
So,
you still didn't know cross-dressing or transgender or that verbiage.
well, I think through exposure to media, probably by the time I was at least 10 or so, pretty much knew what a crossdresser was.
Okay.
So, just because different movies and things, I always say that the first exposure that I ever got, at least during my lifetime so far, well, back then, was the movie Dress to Kill. So, and that was the first movie that at least I watched that had any mention of a transgender person in it all. Because Michael Caine, I believe, was the starring actor in that. And he played a psychologist who had this dual personality, and the other personality was this female nurse named Bobby who would go around killing people. So, of course, as usual, Hollywood took things that were different and unusual and made a dark
A
spin on it,
stereotype of it.
right, as they usually do. So, anything that's not considered to be normal by society, they will always tend to put a dark spin to it and try to demonize it, so to say.
Right.
But, that's just my
That's a whole
opinion.
nother episode.
Yeah, it's another right. That's another whole episode. But that was the first time that I ever had heard of a transgender person. And Leslie Ann Warren was the supporting actress in that. And I just remember that there was one point where she talked about, how men can transition to become women and take hormones and their skin gets softer. And I thought that was very interesting at the time. But of course, it was just a movie. And so I kind of just blew it off and just went about my way. And again, through the years, I just considered this cross dressing as something that was very personal to me. So it was something that I went for my own comfort, my own, desires, I guess you'd say, at the time. At least that's what I thought they were. And so therefore, to me, it became normal within my life. So when I met you, uh, I had to think about how I was going to handle that. So, because even to this day, I tend to be a very honest and sincere, person. I don't like lying to people. So, therefore, I, sort of made this pact with myself back then, anyway, that I was not going to do anything to harm, so to say, my girlfriend or partner who I was with at the time. So I wanted to be very open about it. So eventually I gained enough courage to let you know that I liked to wear women's clothes occasionally. So, and I believe that was after the first night that we actually had sex for the first time, right?
Right. I believe so, or very early into
Right.
that.
And
And
you weren't very easy either. She made me work for it.
so, but and for me, I didn't know what to make of that.
Right.
And that was the only conversation. And that conversation was, "Okay."
Yep. And then I just basically let it
And
go
we
at that
both
point.
let it go. So,
So
I
yeah, because I
it
was
was
basically, without even kind of thinking about it, I'm sure in the back of my head I was looking for what her reaction was going to be, and of course her reaction was very neutral. So I just pretty much let it go at
yeah.
that point.
And I didn't know what that exactly meant
Right.
either at the time. I mean, I'm a pretty open-minded person, but I'm a very traditionalist as well. Um, it's it right or wrong, indifferent, whatever, different perceptions. But I, have no problem with other places, other people's choices, but now it was affecting me, and I
Right.
didn't know what that meant. So, but we never talked about it again. We got married.
Right.
How many years before it kind of crept up?
Well, in all honesty, I was doing a lot of cross dressing without your knowledge. So, because we worked different work schedules, I was an airline pilot for a while. So, whenever I went out of town, I would usually pack something for me to get dressed in at night when I was in the hotel room by myself. And then when I was home, of course, when you weren't there and I knew you were at work or somewhere else, that I could basically play. So, and have my time to cross dress. So, but of course, I wanted to get you more involved with that. So I gained an interest in things like going out to thrift stores and trying to buy clothing for myself that was female clothing, of course. So, but I think the thing that really made the biggest change was when I lost my job.
Hmm.
So, we've talked about that before, but that was probably the biggest change to my maybe awareness of what was going on, because then of course my entire world was changed by that, the loss of a job, being home all the time trying to find another job. So I had a lot of time on my hands.
Yeah, 'cause I was working extra hours and
Right, and you were working
everything
complete
else.
opposite schedule at the time. You were working nights. I had gotten a part-time job and I was working days, but that left me to my own devices, so to say.
Right,
And one of the traps that I fell into was getting very addicted to pornography, and that really was what exposed me to a better understanding of what transgender people were. Because back then, this was, we're talking now, early
early 2000s.
2000s,
Yeah,
right? So by then, the internet wasn't new anymore. Um, there was a lot more material out there, and, you know, I was able to find a lot of material out there, but even then, after being exposed to some of that, basically, through pornography, there was transgender pornography and cross dressers and everything else, it still didn't click, so to say, for me that I was transgender. So all I knew is I had an interest in some of these things, and that based upon what, through the years, through keeping things a secret to myself and not really sharing them with you,
right,
it was just something that was for me and not
right,
something that I was going to, at the time, openly discuss with you.
right. And I didn't want to openly discuss it either. I
Right.
agreed to be in the closet and not deal with it because I felt it was more depression. I had no idea that it was transgender tendency at that
Right.
time. Um, so just something of a fetish.
Right. Exactly. And that's really what I had viewed it as just a fetish. Because at that point, there actually was a website that I found that had a dimensions of cross dressing or something like that. It was like classifications of cross dressing. Exact is what exactly how it was worded. And so I looked at this breakdown that this one person had taken time and put a lot of thought in. And, but that was after, some arguments that we'd had.
Yeah, the fighting started happening. I kept finding things, and I at first thought an affair, thought was cheating. I mean,
Right.
that's kind of the normal heterosexual thought process.
Well, yeah, I mean, to your defense too, I mean, it just looked like a typical man who had this fetish for pornography and was trying to act out these fantasies, right?
And
And that all this
he was very
cross-dressing,
depressed.
right, was
I
just a
mean,
fantasy.
and didn't even acknowledge he was depressed.
Right,
Left, I mean, in this part of our lives, for me, at least my perception was that he was living a fantasy life
right.
and not dealing with reality at all.
Well, looking back upon that, I mean, I can agree with you on many points with that. So, but of course, again, hindsight or 2020,
Right.
hindsight is 2020 is
Right.
what I'm trying
And
to
this is
say.
the other reason why we
So,
kind of go over some of this because at the time, there's no way we could have had this conversation.
yeah, not without
No way without
yeah,
a drag out fight, which brings us to our drag out fight. And probably our youngest was 2 and our oldest was 5.
right,
And I finally kind of drew the line in the sand.
right.
And what do you recall from
Well, I just recall you being very emotional about it, and of course, you had a lot of suspicions, and that tended to make me more defensive. So that made me put up more walls against you because, it was all about trying to protect this habit that I had that I didn't know what it was. In reality, I mean, I had this other personality of mine as a woman, because when, you know, our conversation brought up many different uh, aspects of it that I hadn't considered before, right?
it? Right. Well, and for me, it was we had 2 young kids, and I did not know what it meant anything because at this point we're still thinking fetish. And so I basically said, "All right, do you need this?" And you said,
I said, yeah.
and
I
I said,
mean,
"Okay, then let's figure out what this is."
right. So that's when I found that website that had the cross-gender or transgender cross-dresser, I should say,
Right.
classification.
And the whole time, like almost from that day on, every time we talked about it was, "Do you want to cry? Do you want to transition to a
Right.
woman?"
Because through your discovery on the internet, you found out about transgender people, so you gained a better understanding of it. Whereas I believe at the time, I moved more into denial
Yep.
because it forced me to look at myself and that cross-dressing classification. One of the aspects about wearing women's clothing for me was a bit of the fetish side of it. I
Right.
did enjoy some of the fetish side of it, but there are also reasons for that, as we'll discuss in a
Yeah.
little bit. But that further convinced me that my whole part of this was just as a fetish, and that it was just my thing. So don't, it's like don't try to, this is my
There was
personal
this
thing,
big
right?
wall and bubble here that
Right.
I couldn't get through.
Right, so it just made things more difficult. So because I gained less of an understanding by gaining more information,
Right.
actually.
Actually, I went into the research mode. I became the more analytical. And in many ways, I think we switched roles about that time
Right.
in the family.
Yeah, I think I can agree with you with that. I mean, I was always the analytical type of person. I was always the person, well, I still am. But for
In a
whatever
different way.
reason, when it came to this whole topic of being a transgender person and cross dressing and these fetishes, that went right out the window for me,
This
right?
person was totally, a different person. But this is gonna be part 1. We're gonna put this into 2 parts because cross-dressing years is not, quick enough to do in 20, 25 minutes. So I think this is a good
Mhm.
kinda stopping point right now. And, thank you for listening, for, episode 3B, I guess. I don't know what we'll call it, but, the next part of, the cross-dressing years. If you have thoughts or comments or questions that you would like to ask us, ask in general, anything like that, please go to our storyoftransition.com, go to our contact us page, or if you'd like to be on our show, go
Sure.
there as well.
Yep.
So we will see you next time.
Yep. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us at Our Story of Transition. Find us at ourstoryofTransition.com. Brought to you by the Next Gen Group.